Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be diving into the social development in our lifespan development unit, looking at Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages and James Marcia's identity statuses. So let's go ahead and take a look. When thinking about social development, we are often looking at comparing ourselves to people around us. What type of social pressure we feel we must adhere to at different stages in our life. When we feel we must be hitting certain milestones at specific times compared to our peers, we often refer to that as our social clock. That pressure we feel to make decisions on things like where to go to school for college, what our major should be, when we should be getting married, are all social stages that are not as prescribed as maturation, but we often feel we must be achieving them at certain points in time in our lives based on the social pressure that we feel. Erik Erikson was a psychologist who looked at psychosocial stages of development, and he believed that each stage of development was marked by a specific conflict that must be resolved in order for successful development and moving on to the next stage of our lives. This begins with early childhood and the trust versus mistrust stage. In this first stage, usually from birth to about a year and a half, this really goes right along with our attachment theories that says we need to form that attachment early on, knowing that we can trust others in our lives to take care of us, knowing that the world is a safe place due to the treatment we receive from our caregivers. If we don't receive that, as we saw in attachment theory, there could be problems later on. We might not view the world as a trusting place and have difficulty with trusting others. When we reach the toddler stage, about a year and a half to 3 years, the conflict is autonomy versus shame and doubt. Autonomy meaning doing things on our own, or the shame and doubt we might feel if we cannot do things for ourselves. So think about those early toddlers learning how to do things for themselves, dressing themselves, maybe picking out some pretty interesting outfits, tying their shoes, maybe pouring their own glass of milk, right? These are things that a child might do to establish autonomy. And if they cannot do them, if they make mistakes, so say with pouring that milk, they spill all over the table or they drop it, they might develop that feeling of shame and doubt that they cannot do these things for themselves. So establishing that sense of autonomy is really important for their development. By the time we get to about that preschool age, about 3 to 5 years old, we enter into what's known as initiative versus guilt, where now that control that we saw in autonomy versus shame and doubt starts to push out into their environment, not just controlling themselves, but also controlling their environment around them, really social interactions with other people. This is the first stage where they might be going to school, interacting with other children their own age, taking initiative in their friendships, or they might feel guilty for being either too forceful or too fearful. So again, think about a preschool age child who's very bossy on the playground, telling other people what to do, or too timid and having difficulty in initiating those relationships. Those are kind of the two ends of the guilt side we might see at this stage. But developing those first healthy interactions take place at this stage of initiative versus guilt. And then we enter into elementary school. And this is that stage of industry versus inferiority. And this again has a lot of comparison tied to it. Think about how in elementary school, we were often trying to see how we stack up to our peers, having races on the blacktop to see who could run the fastest, who could kick the kickball the farthest, who was the best artist in your class. These were all things we were acutely aware of because we were constantly comparing ourselves to others. So at this stage, we want to feel industrious. We want to feel like we are as good as our peers at whatever task it is we're engaging in. And if we're not, we might develop a sense of inferiority, a feeling like we are not as good as others in a specific field or as a whole, depending on how this stage affects us. Once we enter into the high school age of adolescence, this is where we see the conflict of identity versus role confusion. And we're going to dive into this deeper when we look at James Marcia's theory. But this stage is where we start to figure out what we believe and who we are. Oftentimes, up to this point, a lot of our identity is based on our family, what our parents tell us we should think and how we should act and what we should believe. But usually around this stage is where we start to question it. With our hypothetical reasoning skills, thanks to Piaget, we can start to think about these concepts for ourselves, and we start to establish our own identity. Sometimes our new ideas or opinions are in contrast to what our parents told us, and sometimes we decide that we do agree and believe the same things. But it's up to each individual to explore and decide what their identity is going to be. And then we enter into early adulthood, typically the 20s and 30s. And the key conflict at this stage, according to Erikson, is intimacy versus isolation. And this is the focus on long-term relationships. These could be romantic relationships and marriage, but these also could just be long-term friendships. Often, post-college, individuals might move to a new city, start new jobs, and they have to start over again in making friends that they did not have in high school or college. So oftentimes at this stage, the question that people are asking is, who are my people? Who are the people that I'm going to spend my time with for a very long time, whether that is a romantic relationship or friendships? These are the struggles that a person might encounter in early adulthood. And then we enter into middle adulthood. Think the 40s and 50s. And we experience the stage known as generativity versus stagnation. This is essentially the midlife crisis stage, where a person starts to question what they are creating or if they feel stuck. This could be in work or it could be in other parts of their lives. If they are parents, are my kids going to be good, productive people? Am I creating something that is going to endure? These are questions that someone asks in this middle adulthood stage of generativity versus stagnation. If they feel stagnant, if they feel stuck, then perhaps they are going to try something new. Maybe they buy a sports car, change careers, do something else that's going to try and help shake up their day-to-day routine if they are feeling stuck or stagnant. And the final stage is integrity versus despair. And this is basically 60s, 70s, 80s, whatever the end of life stage might be. And this is where a person spends time looking back on their life. And the question they are asking themselves is, am I proud of what I've done? Am I filled with integrity? Or am I filled with despair, regrets of things that I didn't do or things that I wish I could have accomplished? And do I feel like I am now out of time? So these are the psychosocial stages, according to Erik Erikson, that basically all people go through throughout the course of their lifetime. Some of these happen as a natural result of development and the different environments we're in, and some of them might happen as a result of that social clock and that pressure that we feel at different ages to have accomplished specific milestones. Now, I would like to go back and take a deeper look at the identity versus role confusion stage of adolescence, because this is a stage that was expanded upon by James Marcia. So James Marcia wanted to understand how we establish our sense of identity. And what he created was 4 identity statuses. They're not stages because we don't necessarily go through all of them, and we don't necessarily go through all of them in the same order. But these four statuses are what he say adolescents may fall into as they go through developing their sense of identity. So the first status is what's known as identity foreclosure. And this is where an adolescent just accepts the identity and values that were given to them in childhood. So really sort of blindly going along with what their family tells them to, not questioning it. That's different than questioning and agreeing with your parents. This is where they just haven't given it another thought. The second status is identity moratorium. And moratorium is the search, the identity crisis stage. This is where a person is not fully committed to their identity yet, but they are actively developing it, searching, trying new things, questioning things to finally decide on what they believe in and who they want to be as individuals. The third status is diffusion. And identity diffusion is when someone has no clear idea, but they're also not searching. They sort of have given up in their identity search, or perhaps there's more pressing issues in their lives that prevent them from searching for their identity at this point in time. And then finally, the last status is, of course, identity achievement. And that is when a person has gone through the moratorium, they have searched and decided, and they have a well-defined identity of personal values and self-concepts. Now, again, not everyone goes through all of these statuses. Some people might stay in foreclosure. Some might go from foreclosure to searching to achievement. Some might go from moratorium to diffusion, where they have to give up for a while. Maybe they go back to moratorium and go back to achievement. And maybe someone in achievement all of a sudden experiences a crisis where they end up back in moratorium as well. So they're not stages, but more different statuses that a person might go through as they seek to develop their own identity. So that's where we're going to go ahead and stop for today. In our final development video, we're going to take a look at gender development, parenting styles, and aging and the end of the lifespan. So thank you so much for watching, and as always, remember, be kind to your mind.